Angeline, or The Haunted House, by Emile Zola. Almost 2 years ago now, I found myself riding on my bicycle along a deserted country lane in the region of Orgeval, just north of Poissy, when I was greatly surprised by the sudden appearance, quite close to the road, of a large house. I alighted from my machine in order that I might see it more clearly. It stood there under the grey November sky as the cold wind swept the fallen leaves, a brick-built house of no especial character in the middle of a vast garden filled with elderly trees. But what made it unusual, what, indeed, endowed it with a wild strangeness which set one's nerves on edge, was the awful state of abandon in which it had been left. And so it was, since one of the iron gates had broken from its hinges, and since a large board announced in paint, which had been faded by the rains, that the property was for sale, that I entered the garden, yielding to a curiosity which was tinged with apprehension. The house must have been uninhabited for some 30 or 40 years. Through the course of many winters, bricks had worked loose from the cornices and by the window frames, allowing the invasion of moss and lichens. The walls were lined with cracks, like premature wrinkles, marking what was still a sound enough building, but for which no one cared any longer. Below the front door, the stone steps, broken by the frosts and guarded by nettles and brambles, seemed to present a threshold to desolation and death. But most of all, the atmosphere of melancholy emanated from those bare glaucous windows, their curtains gone, their glass smashed by stones from passing children, which permitted a view into the sombre emptiness of the rooms, like the open eyes of a corpse whose soul had been extinguished. Around the house, a vast garden was a scene of devastation. What once had been a flower bed was now scarcely recognisable under the rampant growth of weeds. Whole paths had been devoured by voracious plants. The shrubberies had reverted to the character of virgin forests. I was presented with an impression of wild vegetation, such as one finds in an abandoned cemetery, and all that day, under the damp shade of ancient trees whose last leaves were being carried off by the autumn wind, crying its sad complaint. For a long time I stood there, surrounded by this wail of despair, which seemed to come from all that I saw about me. My heart was heavy with a dull fear, a growing unease, yet I was held by a burning compassion, a need to know and sympathise with all I could feel around me of unhappiness and suffering. Then, having finally made my decision to leave, and having perceived beyond the way in the fork of two roads a sort of inn, a poor place where one could buy a drink, I went in, resolved to satisfy my curiosity by encouraging the local people to talk. The only person I found there was an old woman who served me a glass of beer with a great deal of complaining. She complained that she found herself here on this forgotten road, where not 2 cyclists a day would pass. She talked aimlessly, related the story of her life, revealed that she was known as Mère Toussaint, that she had come from Vernon with her man in order to take over the inn, that at first things had gone not too badly, but that since she was widowed, everything had gone from bad to worse. Finally, after her flood of words, when I started to ask her about the nearby house, she became suddenly more circumspect, regarding me with a suspicious eye, as if I were attempting to tear from her some awful secret. "Oh, you mean Le Sauvagier? The haunted house, as they call it around here? Pfft, I know nothing of that, monsieur. That goes back before my time. I have been here just 30 years next Easter, and that goes back nearly 40 years. When we came here, the house was merely more or less in the state you see it now. Summers pass and winters pass, and no one sees anyone move in there, except for the occasional falling stone." But I asked, why hasn't it been sold, since it's for sale? "Oh, why indeed? How should I know? They talk about it enough." In the end, I must have gained her confidence, whereupon it was clear that she was only too anxious to recount to me what it was that people talked about. First, she told me how not one of the girls from the village would dare to venture into the grounds of La Sauvagière after dusk, because it was rumoured that some poor soul returned there by night to haunt it. When I expressed surprise that such a story should still be found credible near to Paris, she shrugged her shoulders, endeavouring to appear composed, but before long revealing her unspoken terror. "But consider the facts, monsieur. Why has it never been sold? There have been prospective purchasers come and go, but they always leave more quickly than they arrived, and not one will ever come back a second time. And I can tell you one thing for sure. If any visitor dares to venture inside the house, extraordinary things happen. Doors slam noisily of their own accord, as if some awful wind were blowing. Cries, moans, and the sound of sobbing rising from the cellars, as if anyone dares to stay any longer. A heart-rending voice starts to call out again and again, 'Angeline, Angeline, Angeline,' in such an anguished tone as to chill the very marrow of your bones. What I am telling you are proven facts. No one will deny them." I assure you that my emotions were beginning to stir, and a shiver ran down my spine. "But who is this Angeline?" "I can see, monsieur, that you are determined to know the whole story, but though I must tell you again that I really know nothing myself." Nevertheless, she proceeded eventually to tell me everything. Some 40 years previously, in about 1858, just at the time when the victorious Second Empire was holding one celebration after another, Monsieur de Gars, who held a post at the Tuileries Palace, lost his wife. He had by her a daughter, some 10 years old, called Angeline, indescribably beautiful and the living image of her mother. 2 years later, Monsieur de Gars married again, and his second wife was another renowned beauty, the widow of a general. Apparently, following this second marriage, a terrible jealousy grew up between Angeline and her stepmother. The one grief-stricken to see her mother already forgotten, her place in the family so quickly usurped by this outsider. The other obsessed to distraction by the idea of having constantly before her this living portrait of a woman who she feared could never be forgotten. La Sauvagière belonged to the new Madame de Gars, and it was there, so the story went, that one evening, on seeing the father lovingly embrace his daughter, in her jealous rage she struck the little girl such a blow that the wretched child fell to the floor dead, her neck broken. The end of the story was gruesome. The distraught father consented to bury his daughter himself in one of the cellars of the house in order to save the murderess. The body of the child remained hidden there for years, while the story was put about that she'd gone away to an aunt's. Then one day, the howling of a dog, who was found feverishly scratching at the ground, caused the crime to be discovered. Although the scandal of the discovery was subsequently suppressed by the Tuileries authorities, now both Monsieur and Madame de Gars were dead. But Angeline still returned every night to answer the call of that pitiful voice which summoned her from that mysterious world beyond the darkness. "No one will deny what I have told you," concluded the old woman. "It is as true as I am standing here." I had listened to her account in awe, struck by its implausibility, yet captivated by the dark and violent singularity of the drama. I had heard of this Monsieur de Gars. I think I had known that he had remarried and that a family tragedy had overtaken him. Was it then true? What a moving and tragic story, exposing human passion to the point of exasperated frenzy, the most awful crime of passion one could ever imagine. A little girl as beautiful as a summer's day, loved and cherished, struck down by her stepmother and then buried by her father in the corner of a cellar? What exquisite horror! I wanted to hear more, to talk about it, but I asked myself, to what end? Why not depart with this flower of popular imagination, this terrifying tale? As I remounted my bicycle, I cast a last glance in the direction of La Sauvagière. Night was falling, and the desolate house looked back at me through the lifeless eyes of its dull, empty windows, whilst the autumn wind sighed a lament amongst the decaying trees. Why should that story have become fixed in my mind until it became an agonizing obsession? It was one of those intellectual mysteries which are difficult to account for. In vain, I told myself that such myths are rife in the countryside, that this particular one could have no real interest for me personally. Despite it all, the dead child haunted my thoughts. Sweet, tragic Angeline, summoned every night for 40 years by a voice whimpering among the empty rooms of the abandoned house. So, for the first 2 months of the winter, I set about doing some research. Obviously, if ever such a disappearance, such a dramatic happening had been noised abroad, the newspapers of the time would surely have spoken of it. I searched through the collections in the National Library without success. There was not a line which could have been linked to such a story. Then I questioned people who might have known something at the time, employees of the Tuileries. None were able to give such a clear answer. All I obtained was contradictory information. In fact, I had all but abandoned any hope of finding out the truth, though I was still tormented by the mystery when, one morning, fate guided me onto a new track. Every 2 or 3 weeks, out of a feeling of comradeship, affection and admiration, it was my habit to visit the elderly poet Vey, who died last April, aged 70. For many years, his legs had been paralysed and he was restricted to an armchair in his little studio in the Rue Assas, the window of which looked out on the Luxembourg Gardens. He was coming to the end of a life of dreaming. He had lived by his imagination and created for himself a fabulous palace where, far from the real world, he had loved and suffered. Which of us does not recall his kind, delicate face, his white hair and his childish curls, his pale blue eyes with their youthful innocence? It would be wrong to say that he never told the truth, but the fact is that he was forever inventing, with the result that one never quite knew where reality ended for him and where illusion began. He was a charming old man who had long since ceased to be part of everyday life, but whose conversation often touched me deeply as a vague, discreet revelation of the unknown. Thus I found myself that day chatting with him by the window in his tiny room, warmed as always by a blazing fire. Outside there was the severest of frosts, so that the Luxembourg Gardens presented a snow-white carpet, a vast horizon of immaculate purity. For some reason, I suddenly found myself telling him of La Sauvagière and the story which still preoccupied me, the father's remarriage, the stepmother's evil jealousy of the little girl who was the living portrait of her mother, the clandestine burial in the cellar. He listened to me with the same tranquil smile he wore even when he was sad. There followed a silence. His pale blue eyes gazed into the far distance, across the white expanses of the Luxembourg Gardens, and the shadow of a vision which emanated from him seemed to shudder vaguely around him. "I used to know Monsieur le Gars very well," he said slowly. "I knew his first wife, a divinely beautiful woman. I knew his second wife also, whose beauty was every bit as dazzling, and I was passionately in love with both, although I never revealed the fact. I also knew Angeline, who was even more lovely, but things did not happen quite as you have said." I became very excited. Was it here then, the unexpected truth I had despaired of ever knowing? Was I about to discover everything? At first, I was only too ready to believe what he was about to tell me, and I replied, "Oh, my dear friend, what a service you will render me. At last my poor heart will be eased. Tell me quickly. I must know everything." But he was not listening to me. He was still gazing distractedly into the distance. When at last he spoke, it was as if in a dream, as if he had created the beings and the things he evoked for me. "Angeline, by the age of 12 years, already possessed a woman's power to love, with all its capacity to feel joy and pain. It was she who became insanely jealous of her father's new wife, whom she saw daily in his arms. She suffered at the sight of this terrible betrayal on the part of the new couple. It was no longer her mother they were affronting. It was she herself who was being tortured. It was her heart that was wounded. Every night she heard her mother calling from the grave. Then one night, determined to be reunited with her, no longer able to stand the pain, already dying from an excess of love, this little girl of 12 years thrust a knife into her heart." I cried out, "Good heavens, can that really be?" He went on, without hearing me. "Imagine with what terror, what horror Monsieur and Madame le Gars discovered Angeline, The next morning in her bed, the knife plunged into her right breast, right up to the handle. They were due to leave for Italy the following day, and there was nobody left in the house except an elderly maid who had brought up the child. In their panic that they might have been accused of a crime, they had the old maid bury the young body. But they in fact buried it in the corner of the conservatory behind the house, at the foot of a giant orange tree. And there it was that when it was found, when after the death of both parents, the old maid told her story. By this time, some doubts had begun to enter my mind, and I looked at him anxiously, asking myself whether he was fabricating. But I asked, "Do you believe that Angeline really could return again every night in order to answer the heart-rending cry of the mysterious voice which summons her?" "Return again, my friend? Ah, but everyone returns again. Why shouldn't the soul of a poor child inhabit again the place in which she both loved and suffered? If a voice is heard calling after her, then life has not yet begun again for her. But it will do. Be assured of that. For everything begins again. Love is never lost, nor beauty. Angeline, Angeline, Angeline. One day she will live again in the sun and the flowers." Decidedly, I was now neither convinced nor comforted. My old friend Vey, the child poet, had done nothing but increase my discomposure. It was evident that he was fabricating, yet, like all seers, perhaps he was able to divine the truth. "You are sure everything you have told me is the absolute truth?" I ventured to inquire with a laugh. "Of course it is the truth. Is not everything to do with the infinite the truth?" I was never to see him again, and shortly afterwards I was obliged to leave Paris. He remains in my mind, however, his pensive gaze lost on the white expanse of the Luxembourg Gardens, so calm in the certainty of his infinite dream, whereas I was still tortured by my desire to establish once and for all that elusive phenomenon, the truth. A year and a half went by. I had been obliged to travel. My life had been affected by many joys and many sorrows on the stormy seas which bear us all away to unknown shores. But again and again, I would hear at a certain hour, first far away, then entering my conscious mind, that desperate cry, "Angeline, Angeline, Angeline," and it would leave me trembling, full of new doubts, tortured by the need to know. I could not forget, and there is nothing worse for me than the hell of uncertainty. I cannot say how it came about that one glorious June evening I found myself once more on my bicycle in the deserted lane by La Sauvagière. Had I consciously wished to see it again, or was it in an instinct which had directed me to turn off the main road and return to these parts? It was close to 8 o'clock, but at the end of one of the longest days of the year, the sky was still brilliant with a triumphantly setting sun, without a cloud, and infinite of azure and gold. And how sweet and delicate the air was, how fine the scents of the trees and the grass, what a subtle delight the immense peacefulness of the fields. As on the first occasion when I arrived before La Sauvagière, astonishment caused me to jump down from my machine. For a moment I hesitated. Was this the same place? A fine new gate shone in the light of the setting sun. The garden walls had been restored, and the house, which I could barely perceive behind the trees, seemed to me to have regained the joyful gaiety of youth. Was this then the promised resurrection? Had Angeline returned to life to answer that distant voice? I was standing transfixed in the roadway when the sound of a shuffling gait behind me caused me to start. It was Mère Toussaint, bringing home her cow from a neighbouring field. "So they weren't afraid?" I asked, motioning towards the house. She recognised me and halted her animal. "Ah, monsieur, there were those who would trample on God himself. The house was bought over a year ago now. It was a painter that did it, the artist Bay. And you know what these artists will do?" Whereupon she moved her cow on, adding with a shake of her head, "Well, we shall have to wait and see what happens." The painter Bay, that delicate, inventive artist who had portrayed so many delightful Parisiennes. I knew him slightly. We had shaken hands at the theatre, in exhibitions, places where one runs into people. Suddenly I was overcome by an irresistible desire to enter, to confess to him, to beg him to tell me what he knew of the truth about La Sauvagière, whose mystery obsessed me. And without further thought, without care for my dusty cyclist attire, which custom is beginning to tolerate these days in any case, I wheeled my bicycle over to the mossy trunk of an old tree. At the clear sound of the bell, the lever of which had accidentally struck the gate, there appeared a servant to whom I gave my card and who bade me wait a moment in the garden. My surprise increased when I looked around me. The facade of the house had been repaired. No more cracks, no dislodged bricks. The steps, garnished with roses, had become once again a threshold of joyous welcome. The living windows were now smiling, telling of the joy within, behind their white lace curtains. As for the garden, it had been cleared of its nettles and brambles. The flower bed had reappeared like a gigantic scented bouquet. The ancient trees had acquired new youth in their peaceful old age, under the golden rain of the spring sunshine. When the servant reappeared, he led me into a drawing room, informing me that his master had gone to the neighbouring village, but would be back before long. I was ready to wait for hours. I passed the time examining the rooms in which I found myself. It was luxuriously furnished with thick, deep carpets and cretonne curtains, which matched the massive sofa and deep armchairs. These hangings were so extensive that when dusk suddenly arrived, it took me by surprise. Before long, it was almost completely dark. I do not know how long I had to wait there. I had evidently been forgotten. Not even a lamp was brought for me. Seated in the shadows, I started to relive the whole tragic story, to lose myself in reverie. Had Angeline been murdered? Had she thrust a knife into her own heart? And I have to admit that in this haunted house, upon which darkness had fallen once again, I felt fear. What initially was not much more than a certain unease, a slight chill, proceeded to grow beyond all proportion into an irrational terror which froze my whole being. At first it seemed to me that I could hear obscure sounds in the distance. They must be coming from the depths of the cellars. A vague moaning, stifled sobs, heavy, ghostly footsteps. Then whatever it was began to come up from below, to draw closer, until the whole house seemed in darkness to be filled with terrible distress. Suddenly, the awful cry rang out, "Angeline! Angeline! Angeline!" with such growing force that it seemed to me I felt a cold breath touch my face. One of the drawing-room doors opened noisily. Angeline entered and crossed the room without seeing me. I recognized her in the dim light which had penetrated with her from the hall outside. It was indeed the dead child of 12 years, incredibly beautiful, with her exquisite blonde hair upon her shoulders, dressed in white, the white of the earth from which she'd returned every night. She passed by in silence, abstracted, then disappeared through another door, while once again the voice called out, this time from further off, "Angeline! Angeline! Angeline!" I was left there standing with sweat on my forehead, in a state of horror which caused every hair of my body to rise in the dreadful wind which emanated from the enigma. Then almost immediately, as the servant finally came in with the lamp, I was conscious that the artist Bay was there, shaking my hand and apologizing for having let me wait so long. Without any attempt to reserve my self-respect, I rushed into telling him my story. As I did so, I was still trembling. At first he listened to me with no little surprise, and then with great good humour he hastened to reassure me. "My dear fellow, you are probably unaware of the fact that I am the cousin of the second Madame de Gars," the poor woman, to be accused of the murder of a child whom she loved and mourned quite so much as her father. For there is only one part of the story which is true. The poor creature did indeed die here, not by our own hand, for heaven's sake, but of a sudden fever. The shock was so great that her parents, having conceived a horror of this house, never wished to return here, which explains why it remained uninhabited for so long as they were alive. After their death, there followed interminable legal proceedings which prevented its sale. I wanted it, having coveted it for many years, and I can assure you that we have never seen any ghosts here. The chill returned to me as I mumbled, "But I have just seen Angeline, here, only a moment ago. That frightful voice summoning her. She passed by here through this very room." He looked at me alarmed, believing perhaps that I was losing my sanity. Then suddenly he laughed. the resounding laugh of a man who is happy. That was my daughter you saw just now. Her godfather was in fact Monsieur Le Gars, who gave her the name Angeline as an act of devoted memory. Having no doubt been called by her mother, she must have passed through this room. Thereupon, he opened the door himself and called out again, "Angeline! Angeline! Angeline!" The child returned, now alive, now vibrant with gaiety. It was she, with her white dress, her exquisite blonde hair upon her shoulders, so beautiful, so radiant with hope, that she was like the spring itself, bearing in form of a bud the promise of love, the lasting happiness of life. What a charming ghost was this new child, born again from the one who had died. Death had been conquered. My old friend, the poet They, had not lied. Nothing is lost forever. Everything begins again, both beauty and love. Their mothers call them, these little girls of today, these lovers of tomorrow. And they live again, under the sun and among the flowers. The house had been haunted by the promise of this reawakening. Today the house was once more youthful and happy in the rediscovered joy of eternal life. If you're still awake, please like and subscribe. Good night.